that brings us almost to the end. Now, it's an incredibly hard challenge to try to wrap up and summarise everything that we've covered through today. But fortunately, Boris has agreed to do that for us. So, Boris, thank you for being so brave as to cover everything in these final comments. Over to you.
Well, Hugo, I think you said it all. I don't actually need to dwell on for too long. But today is a very important meeting. We come at a time where we're coming out of a pandemic. Now, if you're an infectious diseases specialist and you retire from medicine, you've waited the whole of your life for a pandemic to come about. And this one came about just as I retired. But let's turn the whole thing on its head. We've actually talked about the pandemic and the COVID pandemic as a problem. Let me turn that around and say, what does the pandemic teach us about opportunity? The truth about all pandemics, when you look at them globally, is that pandemics initiate global change, and this one will not be an exception. You go back to the Black Death. What happened? The whole feudal system in Europe collapses. And Ziegler, in fact, argues that the whole Reformation starts because the trust between the link between religion and feeling well was suddenly broken, and the loss of that trust resulted in the collapse of the Catholic Church and the Reformation in Europe. Venice, mid-17th century. Huge pandemic hits Venice. What happens? The governance of Venice collapses. Does Venice disappear? No. It changes to a very different city and a very different culture. Just fast forwarding, 1918, a memorable year. How many men lost their lives in the First World War? Just as many lost their lives in the flu pandemic of 1918. What happens? A sudden realization, gosh, there is this other species on the planet called women. And you know what? They should have a voice. They should actually have a presence. So we begin to see finally the implementation of gross and important changes in society. And I think this pandemic will make for change. So how do we take advantage of that? For me, I heard an awful lot today about the impact on education of the pandemic. Fine, absolutely right. And some of that has been really quite disastrous to both individual students and to the way in which things have been delivered through a variety of systems that have not survived, in essence, the impact of the pandemic. But that also needs to teach us where the solutions might actually reside. CAMFED itself has shown us how you develop bottom-up networks, the drive, the push, the demand for better education for girls in circumstances that are incredibly difficult. And quite rightly, it's recognized by Yidan as one of the laureates, both Angie and again to Lucy, my sincere congratulations. The solutions are going to be hard, but solutions there'll have to be. But let's look at the positive points that have come through. How many of you have developed a great new respect for teachers? Guess why? You've tried teaching at home. And everybody, I think, has realized that after a week or so, this is a very hard occupation to get into. And the students themselves are probably heartily fed up of mum and dad or anyone else trying to teach them in the home circumstance. They've actually begun to learn as well that school plays a far bigger role in their life, and the teachers play a bigger role than just the education or learning of facts and the boring lessons that you've raised. There's actually something about meeting friends, creating your own societies, engaging, questioning. These things have never been talked about before. We now talk about them openly. We've got to cash in on that. We've got to recognize that COVID has also taught us and taught governments that long-term solutions are necessary to prevent the next pandemic. Learning from that, guess what? Long-term investment in education yields results downstream that can make far bigger improvements in society as a consequence. So a change from short-term to long-term thinking, when they begin to realize that the vaccines we have against COVID were actually 20 years in the making. They didn't just appear magically, but by investment from 20 years before that enables the current vaccines to be working. In the same way, early years and the importance of early years education, I think, has got the chance, a seed that can be planted now to really yield in the future. Recognition of inequality. Oh yes, we paid lip service to talking about inequalities. Suddenly it's become very real. People suddenly realizing there are gender inequalities. And usually in an audience where we're discussing inequalities mostly to gender for women, more men die of COVID than women. Suddenly that makes people think. Inequalities of the Afro-Caribbean communities who died disproportionately, the inequalities of poverty, the inequalities of obesity in relation to the pandemic, suddenly makes thinking about inequalities front and center of the mindset of policymakers for the future. So let's really hit them now with the inequalities in education and the consequences of that globally. Real people matter. We've also learned that mental well-being, which we heard so much about today, is a very important part. It's not enough just to educate or to throw facts at people. We actually need people to have a level equilibrium, both the teachers, the parents, and the students. That was not talked about before. Suddenly, we're recognizing that there is a bigger set of issues here about what we demand from life today and for the future. So again, something that really comes to the forefront. But how do we convince? I'm going to go back to something that Julia said very early on. I addressed part of it in my response to public health. It's data. You've got to have compelling outcomes that you're looking at that are outcomes in the real world, so that you can look at the aspirations of what parents and students want from an educational system that is valid and real and is measurable. And at the same time, you've got to be able to support to ensure that there is global comparability of those, that they are as real in the United Kingdom when we consider Zambia or Zimbabwe as a case in point, because we can draw comparisons as to how well or badly a country is doing and where additional support may be required. Because the other learning from the pandemic is working together, and collaboration goes right to the heart of what we can achieve. So we now know, and the slogans are there, where none of us is safe until every one of us is safe on this planet. That's the message of COVID. So are we going to have a well-educated world? No, we're not. Not until every child gets access to the education that they need so that we can begin to really tackle the inequalities that are there. And lastly, we actually heard something fantastic, I think, from the students. It throws me back to an old philosopher called Humboldt in the 1800s. You wouldn't think that what you were raising was exactly what Humboldt was raising and Princess Laurentian was raising. He made a statement, and it was a statement made about the philosophy of why universities. And his statement was that it's about the teacher and the student walking hand in hand into a land of new knowledge, not the student imparting knowledge to the student, but actually the two working together to ensure that we continue to enhance for everything for the future. So I now have a very pleasurable task. And it relates a little to maybe that data and the way in which we're going to make that argument. And this is a real personal pleasure for me because it's two wonderful organizations that I know exist here and work so hard from here, but also around the world. And that's to announce that CAMFED and the Real Centre are launching a new partnership to examine how community-led interventions that target the needs of the most marginalised children can be scaled through education systems in Tanzania and in other countries in the region. Now this matters because this research will focus on the role of the learner guide. As a recent female school graduate who volunteers in her local school to mentor girls, support catch-up learning amongst the most marginalised children that are there. And can you deliver a life skills curriculum? And all of those wider issues that we talked about that go beyond the mere grades that you refer to, that is not what this is about. It is about that wider impact of education. And it builds on a whole series of collaborations between RIL and CAMFED, but to me, it also exemplifies something else. It's a real effort to get objective data because at the end of the day, the convincing data is the objective data, and through objective data, we convince the policymakers. Unfortunately, no longer you, Julia, because I know you would be convinced by good data, but we've got to convince them and we've got to win the argument because the future depends on us winning that argument. The future not just for us sitting in this room, not the future just for the students who have very kindly been with us today, but the future for students in far more marginalised societies around the world where they have all the abilities, all of the IQ, all the underlying know-how, and yet they can play their part in making this world a better place. Because what does success look like? What it ultimately has to look like is when there's that age-old adage, when we leave this planet, let's at least try to leave it in a better place than where we found it. And I can't think of anything better than educating children and students in those formative primary and secondary years to achieve that goal. And thank you to the organisers of this meeting for enlightening us and for taking us part of the way on that possible journey. And let's commit ourselves to walk with them on that journey and to use all the powers that we have to ensure that those changes can really happen. I'm sorry if that sounds a bit impassioned, but I am passionate on this topic. And so I removed that apology. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Boris. And that is the end of the conference. It just remains for me to say how lovely it is to see all of you, some for the first time here, some again here, and to say how much of a pleasure it is, as ever, to work with our partners. Lucy and Angie, CAMFED, Pauline and the REAL team, the Faculty of Education. And can also just add my own thanks to my team here at Jesus, who have worked very, very hard. I'm not going to name everybody who's been involved with making this happen, who's been doing the cooking. It wasn't me. And also to thank every single one of our speakers, from the oldest to the youngest. Thank you very much. Have a lovely time.